Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. Today we've got a special guest, Michael from the 5-4 podcast. I think probably a lot of listeners will be familiar with his stuff. But we are taking Merrick Garland down another peg after our episode with Jeff Hauser for, a couple years ago. And we're talking Supreme Court, Trump's, various other cases, and something called Chevron deference. So if you don't know what that is, stay tuned to find out.
That's right. A lot of political relevance from Trump shenanigans and how the various cases might influence the election, even if they don't put him in jail beforehand. And then Chevron deference and the crazy Texas shenanigans are also very interesting, especially Chevron deference, because that's another power grab by the court that is underway. So lots of politically relevant stuff and some salacious stuff. We also insult Democrats quite a bit. It's a good time.
Yeah, but in a fun way. So anyway,
that's right.
Let's cut to the chase and get to our interview with Michael right now. So Michael, welcome to the podcast. I'm sure you're a loyal listener, like all intelligent and well-respected legal analysts. So we wanted to have you on, to talk law stuff, of course, the most important stuff there is. And most especially to begin with the update to the Merrick Garland, expanded universe. There's so Merrick Garland is the Attorney General. He before that, in case folks forgot, he was President Obama's failed nominee to the Supreme Court after Antonin Scalia died, and probably would not have been nominated as Attorney General if it were not for that previous nomination. And so we've got yet one last O'Bungle that is still...
he got pre-borked. He didn't even get a chance to get borked. He was aborted before he could get borked.
Yeah, didn't even get a hearing. Unprecedented. Never happened in American history. And Obama thought, if I hire this feckless conservative white dude, then the Republicans will have no choice but to confirm him, or at least give him a vote.
That works well, usually.
So he had this reputation of being really down the middle. I don't think he ever wrote a majority opinion as an appellate judge that was ever overturned by the Supreme Court. And I think one of the senators said something I think Orrin Hatch or someone's brassly said something well, if Obama were going to nominate someone like Garland, he'd get a hearing, but he's not. And so then Obama is all right. Here's Merrick Garland. You're straight
Eat your words.
Yeah. And it's I don't know. It's such an Obama move, but it's the limits of Obamaism right?
Yeah.
They looked really stupid. You really made them look really stupid as they, got their conservative replacement instead. Good job.
Look, the 100th time we unmask their hypocrisy is when they'll lose power. That's how it's going to work.
Yeah. We owned them by their own logic, and then they overturned Roe versus Wade. But anyway, so, basically now, so he's Attorney General, and, in my view, as someone who did not go to law school, has never been an appellate judge, has never been Attorney General, it seemed to me that the number one job for Merrick Garland, or whoever ended up, a lot of folks said it should have been Doug Jones, the former senator from Alabama, who is known as a sort of hard ass in terms of, getting bad criminals. And it seemed like his job was get Trump. That seemed get him somehow. And basically doesn't matter how you do it, because there's a whole bunch of different opportunities and lots of different laws that he broke. You just got to do one of them, and maybe all of them at the same time. And yet here we are, it's 2024, and the cases only just got started. And lo and behold, the Supreme Court is running interference for him at every turn. And it seems as though probably, there won't be a verdict in most of these important cases before the presidential election, which if Trump wins, he will just make all of those go away, probably. And so there's been this narrative from apologists, I think most notably Marcy Wheeler, who, used to be a scathing critic of Bush era security state, policies, and now for some reason has become a devoted partisan of the Justice Department. But there's you critics don't understand. You don't know what was going on. And Garland was doing it as quickly as possible. And so now this New York Times article comes out, and maybe Michael, can you just sort of run us through the what it illustrates about the Merrick Garland's approach to the Trump prosecution?
Yeah, I think what it illustrates is that he did not agree with you that his big job was get Donald Trump, right? Yeah. I think he would say his big job was to prove that the Department of Justice was independent from the White House after it had been bent to Donald Trump's will for 4 years. And in order to do that, he had to go out of his way to not try to get Donald Trump. And if they somehow fell ass backwards into a Donald Trump prosecution anyway, so be it. But they weren't going to target him. That's the approach he took. That's not really an exaggeration. They basically said, we'll follow the evidence where it takes us, but we're going to start by prosecuting the lowest level rioters on January 6th and see if we can follow connections from any of them up the ladder eventually to Donald Trump. And all the stuff that happened out in the open that you saw live on national TV, that you read about in the pages of the New York Times about him, pressuring the Georgia Secretary of State and riling up the mob at the eclipse, and the months of talking about how it was rigged and the bogus lawsuits, all that shit that dated back even before the election, right? During 2020, we're going to ignore all that. We're not going to look into that. And the investigation into that didn't open properly, according to the New York Times, till April 2022, 15 months after the riot. That is a 15-month delay until the start of the investigation that ultimately led to the major indictments against Donald Trump.
It's like Merrick Garland is the kind of platonic spirit of the very rationale that Obama nominated him for. It was like, right. What can I do that best placates Republicans and Republican voters? And that's going to guide everything I decide to do. But also, maybe Trump has this ability to turn off people's brains, because usually, people don't admit their crimes out loud, let alone on TV. And so you have to do an investigation. And here it's just no, he's just saying it on this record. Everyone saw it.
Yeah.
And it's oh no, that can't possibly be evidence.
Right, exactly. He can't possibly have planned and executed a coup right out in the open.
No. I mean, it's like 12-dimensional chess.
We did my podcast, 5 to 4. We did an episode in, I think, September 2020 called The Coming Electoral College Coup. That's the title of the episode. and then when Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett, I had a little spiel in our episode talking about her. So this is before she was even confirmed, saying, I think my exact words were, Donald Trump doesn't have a plan for re-election. He has a political plan to remain in power should he lose re-election, right? And I'm not saying that we're like Nostradamus. We didn't have sources inside the White House or anything. This was just, I read the papers, I paid attention to what he was saying and what he was doing and took it seriously. That's really it. That's like,
his politics are crass, but they're still political maneuvers. It's not just because, it's right. That's not civil, so it can't be real. I don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's one thing revealed here in the article, and both the behavior you're talking about is, the what maybe Jesse Eisinger, the ProPublica reporter, would call the chicken shit mentality. He wrote this book about prosecutorial cowardice when it comes to high profile white collar crime called the Chicken Shit Club, about federal prosecutors who basically stopped enforcing the law, almost full stop, in the mid 2000s. And, one of them, the hesitation displayed when it was like, people started coming up and saying, we need to get Trump on this, coup d'etat thing. Like, that's pretty illegal. I'm pretty sure there's some laws against doing that. And the FBI and the Justice Department are like, oh shit, we haven't ever tried that before. Can't we get them on some kind of money thing? And they start doing exactly. Follow the money, like they're rolling up a mafia organization where it's all run, secret payments and bribes and all that type of shit. Your basic organized crime ring. And they didn't find anything at all. It's like all the January 6 people paid for their own tickets and stuff like that. Right. You can't get them on like racketeering or something like, and it's like you on the one hand have this, unwillingness to do, it's like a novel prosecution. Oh, can't we just do the same thing we've done before? It's like, well, it's not the same situation. It's a much more serious situation.
Yes, exactly. That is the total lack of imagination here, right? And at the same time, the lack of willingness to engage with reality, which are sort of related, because it's like, once you engage with the reality, you realize that it calls for maybe something different, maybe something other than the normal prosecutorial playbook, right? Okay, the first time we haven't had a peaceful transfer of power since the 1870s or whatever. Maybe we should do something different. Right? Those are connected. It's just like refusing to accept the reality, which, there's a detail in this that I think is probably doesn't fluoresce for a lot of people as relevant in this New York Times story, but they're talking about Merrick Garland, how he was writing his speech for accepting Obama's nomination on January 6th, because he was set to give the talk the next day. And I get that, it's a big thing and it's a day away, but he flicked on the TV just to take a break and saw the riot. I've never watched the electoral count before, but I was tuned in all day because I knew there was going to be violence, right? A lot of people were tuned in because we all knew that Trump had this big mob that he was going to whip up. We knew that he had been talking this up and pressuring Mike Pence and all this shit. And it's like, how checked out are you? You're going to be the next attorney general. And he didn't even know this was coming enough that he sort of turned on the TV and was blindsided and then had to rewrite his whole speech. And it's like, yeah, but maybe you need to do more than just rewrite your speech. Maybe you need to rethink how you're going to approach this, right? Rethink what the threat here is and what your mission is. But there was none of that pretty clearly. Based on their behaviors, they just went right back to whatever their playbook was on November 15th, December 1st, whatever. Nothing could change their mind about how they were going to handle this. And it was, we don't want to investigate Donald Trump. If we're forced to, by circumstances, by a trail of cash or whatever, then we will. But we really want to avoid it as long as possible. That was...
It's like you said, a refusal to see reality that reminds me. It's kind of like the international liberal order rule of law stuff with Gaza right now. It's like we will just refuse to acknowledge that our idea of institutional norms are prevailing here, and that there's something that doesn't fit with the usual narrative. Let's not politicize the Attorney General's office or the Justice Department. I'm sorry, this is political because a former president tried to have a coup. That's political. You have to you can't escape the political nature of that.
Yes.
But it's just the worldview of the kind of liberal centrist status quo is that everything's fine. We just tinker here and there, and the status quo is good. And so we can't be the powers that shake the status quo, instead of acknowledging the status quo has been shaken tremendously by reality.
Right. It's interesting because I think Merrick Garland rightfully gets a lot of scorn, left and center. I think left, right, and center now, because Trump is being prosecuted. And so everybody's angry at him. Nobody thinks he's done a good job at this point. But he was Biden's pick. And I think he very much executed Biden's vision, right? This is the first 2 years of Biden's term pretty much went how he wanted. He didn't want investigations to, take up his term. He wanted to cool things down and get bipartisan infrastructure and fix the economy and all that crap. And not that that stuff is unimportant, but he got it right. Yeah. We have the Biden boom. They a much better recovery than after the 2008 crash. Like totally lapped the Obama administration on that front. Got his bipartisan infrastructure bill. All that stuff, avoided all the big hot button issues coming from his office, at least. And at the end of it, he was miserably unpopular. And if the Supreme Court hadn't overturned Roe v. Wade, the Democrats would have gotten fucking crushed in the midterms. And it was the cultural issues that they wanted to avoid that saved their ass, that they had to be dragged kicking and screaming into caring about and running on. And so Garland, I think, is just sort of a symptom of the underlying disease, which is a politics that's still trapped in like 1985 and still believes the playbook from 1985 is the playbook you need today. And it's not.
Yeah. I maybe even would say like the politics of like 1965, that like, labor unions and economic prosperity and all that, that'll get you past all of the cultural stuff. Yes. You need to, or even you could, I mean, actually, well, thinking about it, civil rights, that was a huge deal in that decade, but, so maybe we're thinking of like 55 instead.
Right. If you're trying to reassemble the New Deal coalition, you have to understand it fractured because people were angry about desegregation. They didn't want integration. They didn't want to integrate. They didn't want an egalitarian society. And it's like, you have to accept at some point, like it's been 70 years. At some point, you just have to accept that there's a political faction that doesn't share your values on equality, on pluralism, on multiracial democracy, and proceed appropriately. Right.
Yeah. And Trump specifically being, I think practically unique menace in American history. In that, cause the second thing I was going to mention about what the behavior, ignoring the blatant stuff reveals, like how these FBI investigators are trying to follow the money. They're looking for some kind of furtive behavior. They're like some kind of secret transaction that's being hidden. And because I think in this case, what that reveals is consciousness of guilt. And then that gives the investigator permission to attack that this is definitely a crime because the perpetrator knows it's a crime and is behaving like it's a crime. If they're just doing out in the open, like Trump did, we may forget, listeners, but I was just reminded of this, that the Georgia call transcript of Trump pressuring the Georgia Secretary of State into basically overturning the election. And he said, something like, quote, find me 11,700 votes. That was published on CNN on January 3rd, before January 6th even happened.
Meanwhile, this is the person who told everyone years before, I can shoot someone on the streets of Fifth Avenue in New York and get away with it. So he's even signaled that he's going to do it in public because he knows he can get away with it. So it's like a meta thing going on there too. He's like even telegraphing that he's going to just like deceive people in the wide open, right?
Yeah, no, the call is so good too, because I was looking into that recently also, and I found I forget if it was CNN, I think it's CNN. It may have been MSNBC, but there was, a major news network that was discussing it. And it's so easy to forget what a huge scandal it was that they were already talking about whether or not he needed to be prosecuted for that. And the consensus was, well, this was definitely a crime. This was definitely criminal. But the question is whether you would be able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And it would be such a high stakes prosecution, and you might be reticent to bring it. But everybody agreed it was a crime, right? And it was this huge scandal, and it just totally gets forgotten about because 3 days later they fucking sacked the Capitol. Like,
yeah. Michael, do you think the problem is that he does too many crimes? Because like, if you think of normal scandals, there's like one set of facts that the public has to digest that like all the reporters ask about this one situation and the public kind of gets it. They're like, oh, I get what happened with Monica Lewinsky, or whatever. Right. Yes. Like, and it's not, but here there's like so much shit he's done that like, and then nothing happens. So everyone's like, well, it all must be bullshit. And he must not have done any of it or something.
Right. I think it's this, and then nothing happens.
And then nothing happens. There's no consequence to any of it.
And so people it starts being like, oh, well, they're just talking shit. Right.
Yeah.
And, this is, I think, the problem with the approach that Garland took, the approach that Biden took, the approach that Democrats have been taking for a very long time, which is, obviously pressuring the Secretary of State is corrosive to democracy, right? To overturn the results. And obviously sacking the Capitol and trying to have a mob kill your vice president because he won't install you as God Emperor Trump. Corrosive to democracy. Like no argument from me. But also a guy openly trying to change the results of the election and just doing crimes while the opposition spends 5 years saying this guy's an existential threat. He's a criminal. Look what he's doing. And then when the opposition takes power, they're like, it's time to move on.
And then Biden invites him, hey, help me deal with the border, Trump. Yeah. Come play with me.
That is also corrosive to democracy. That says
probably worse
to the American people, one of two things: either we're full of shit and we didn't believe a word we said, or there's just different rules. There's just different rules for people like us than there are for you. For Donald Trump, like the worst consequence he'll ever get is just not winning re-election. That's the worst thing that can happen to a politician. They can do whatever the fuck they want. And the worst thing that happens is they don't win re-election. And that's corrosive. That is. And I don't think they think of it that way. And that's the problem. Right. That just like not going after the torture guys, Right.
Obama. Exactly.
It's like the same thing. It's not.
The boys club wants to protect each other's, it's class solidarity in a sense.
Yes. Yeah. That's what it feels like. I mean, it might be cowardice, but from the outside looking
which vice is it? Which combination of vices? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the cowardice, at bottom, you have this institutional frame. It's like what these people claim to be defending. We have to respect the institution. We have to follow the procedures. But if you think about it for 5 seconds, the guy, I mean, I almost feel crazy having to emphasize this over and over again. The guy did an attempted coup. He tried to install himself as dictator. There can be no graver crime in a constitutional system because you're trying to just like burn the Constitution to the ground, get rid of it. And so it's sitting on your hands and twiddling your thumbs for 15 months to get the basically open and shut evidence that was published in public, and happened, on live television. And then, by the way, there's also this like fake elector scheme, that was uncovered basically by the January 6th committee and some journalists, and that stuff was comically easy to figure out. They just subpoenaed a bunch of text messages and emails. It was all right out there, really easy to figure out that they were trying to draw up slates of fake electors as they could go to Congress and be like, these are the real electors, Trump's president again. And so that to me is just like timidity, and you're just too chicken shit to do your job. And I think the other evidence of that is the January 6th committee and the herd behavior of all these prosecutions. Because, in the article and the Garland defenders have insisted for years now, it's like, it's a pure coincidence that this stuff started moving a lot faster after the January 6th committee made us look like a bunch of fucking idiots.
That would be political if they changed in response to that. That would be political. They're not political.
But that is what happened. And, it did put pressure on the Department of Justice. And then I think, the fact that it was like, they hired Jack Smith, and it seems like Jack Smith really did go like pretty much as quickly as you could. It took him like 8 months from being appointed as special prosecutor to bringing all these, election interference charges and so on. And at that time, suddenly now we have charges against Trump all over the place in the state courts and and I think that suggests that all these people were sitting on stuff. They're like, well, I don't want to be the first one. But as soon as Smith broke the seal on that, it was just like, or actually it was Bragg, the district attorney was
the first, but I think you're right. So Bragg in New York, there are these election crimes that go back to 2016. Very, very obvious,
hush money payments,
finance crimes from 2016. And then all these falsified business records to cover up the crimes that are state level issues in New York. So this goes back to 2016, 2017. And then you have the election interference stuff, which in Georgia, right? That's conduct in 2020 and 2021. And then you have the election interference stuff from the federal suit and the documents case, which is all 2020, 2021, and 2022. And yet all these charges are brought within like 4 months of each other, right? And it's like state law, federal law, racketeering, election interference, mishandling the classified documents, all these different investigations. Wow. They all just happened at once. And no, I think you're right. It's nobody wanted to stick their neck out. Nobody wanted to be the only one. Everybody was scared. Everybody was chicken shit. And then Jack Smith started hauling ass, and all of a sudden everybody was like, oh.
Yeah, well, that's crazy. Aren't like, if you look at even just through the movies, aren't prosecutors the most like ambitious, like hungry to make a name for themselves people in like the history of storytelling? Like, aren't they like, I'm going to get this guy and then I'm going to be famous for nailing this important guy? You're like, where are all these people? Where are they? What the hell?
Yeah, I was looking back at some text messages with some friends, and it was from January 2021. And this is literally what I said I was like, I got to think like one of these prosecutors will be like, I'm going to put Donald Trump's head on a spike and be a hero.
Self-interest. That's
like that's like,
how like pure Madison, like ambition will counteract ambition. Like, come on.
Yeah. You know? No, but they were all too scared. And you look
what are they scared of? What are they scared of? Failure of like what bad press?
Yeah,
like losing their job? I don't know.
I'll tell you what they're scared of is all the fucking cowards who come out of the woodwork when this happened, right? There were all these law professors who trashed Bragg when he brought his indictment. There were all the weak-kneed liberal law professors who came out writing New York Times op-ed saying Donald Trump has to remain on the ballot. Colorado absolutely cannot remove him from the ballot.
Let the people decide.
Yeah, exactly. The people, the 400,000.
Because of Donald Trump's famous, understanding of the people deciding. Yeah.
Nobody wanted that heat. Nobody wanted that heat. And if you don't want that heat, then don't be a fucking district attorney or an attorney general or, or the president. Like, that's just it. Like,
right.
That comes with the job. You have a responsibility to the country, to your citizens, to your constituents. Like,
just to spell it out even more clearly for everyone, probably our listeners are taking our word for it, but like, why can't Garland justify his inaction or his strategic decisions as just like, oh, I thought this was the surest way to prosecute the case or to do the investigation? Like, can we talk about what he could have done differently in terms of how he moved?
Yeah, well, I mean, for one thing, he could have
started sooner.
Yeah, he could have just started sooner. Like obviously, at this point, the special counsel at the very least feels very good about the election interference charges, right?
Yeah.
Good enough to bring them, right? Like he thinks they're winnable. And that was.
And there's no reason they could have just done that right away.
Yeah, exactly. That was like there was nothing happened on that front in the 15 months between January 6th and the opening of that investigation. They just didn't want to do it. And it was only Trump's sort of resurgence as a national figure, it seems, that like really spurred them on and be like, oh shit, if we don't do this, nobody's going to do this. Like, and he's just going to come back and come back and come back. But
yeah, I mean, the other thing they could do, I think that's outlined well in this article, is go after Trump at the top directly rather than trying this roll up strategy, which number one, paid off no dividends really in terms of actual, links to Trump. Like that was all just him posting on Twitter and people reading his posts and taking his advice. And B, that consumed a ton of resources because this, I think now is the biggest FBI investigation in history, charging all these thousands and thousands of people with, different crimes. And, it says in the article that was the main reason why, they created this investigations unit in June 2021, and it didn't actually start operating for another 4 months in November. And I think that it's just a horrible allocation of resources. I mean, obviously, like all the people who sacked the Capitol deserve to be prosecuted, but they deserve to be prosecuted the least. You get the people at the top, who did all their crimes in plain sight and whose scheme turned out to be incredibly easy to unravel. It wasn't
actually, famously, if we're going to use the mafia analogy, you give immunity to all the lower level guys so you could get up to the top. Like you want to get to the top as quickly as possible. Like you don't want to just focus on the lower level guys.
Yeah. And it's interesting because they have been accused, I think fairly, of going easy on the rioters for the most part. They've been criticized by judges for saying that, plea deals they negotiated for charges didn't even support the negotiated punishment they wanted. And they're like, well, I can't even put this guy on probation because of the charging decisions you made here and what you agreed to. And you have a lot of parading without a permit shit or whatever.
Trespass.
And you can sort of rationalize this as well. If they're trying to work their way up, they're trying to get cooperation and they're trying to get a lot of these cleared. I guess that kind of makes sense. But the other approach you could have taken was just charge everyone who was near Ashley Babbitt with felony murder, like you would if 5 black kids.
That's right.
Stormed CVS and a cop killed one of them. The other 4 black kids would get charged with felony murder. Charge them with felony murder. Get your easy convictions and then just work out from there and throw that in everybody else's face to get strongly, well, I don't want to get charged with murder, so maybe I'll take this, public disorder charge. And how do I want to say this? We know what it looks like when prosecutors decide to, quote unquote, throw the book at someone, right?
Yeah.
To be like, we're going to nail these people. This wasn't it.
No.
And they could have taken that approach. They could have said, we're just going to throw the book at the rioters and work our way through them while we devote resources to the Trump investigation. And that's not the approach they took.
It's really revealing.
Yeah.
You hear the right wing, the MAGA fans complaining, and you hear this line that's like, or even the pundits, Fox News or whoever saying, if they can do that to Trump, imagine what they can do to you. It's like, no, you've got it backwards. You don't understand. Innocent people are getting fucked over by the criminal justice system or whatever. Like you're already fucked if you break the law. They're going to throw the book at you because you're nobody. The fact that you even said that is because you understand subconsciously that powerful people don't usually get taken down.
Right.
That's a problem. That's not a good thing to protect. Right.
Right. Absolutely. So the entire approach I think was backwards. The entire approach was, we got to get back to normal. And the way to get back to normal is to be normal.
It's to pretend.
It's no, the way to get back to normal is by bringing the hammer down on the people who have been upending the political system, driving them from office, driving them from public life. That is how you get back to normal, is by saying very unequivocally, if you try something like this again, you are fucked. You are fucked.
And of course, the consequence of them not doing that is that he's now made another statement about the next election, the bloodbath that's going to happen if he doesn't win.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's like, you can see this playing out immediately, right? There were all the corporate donors who stopped donating to anyone who was involved in January 6th, all the Republican politicians. And then like a few months later, I think it was like April or May 2021, they all started quietly giving back to them because it's like, oh, I guess
it's not going to be a thing, I guess.
Yeah, I guess it's actually okay. Right.
Yeah.
And it was like the immediate normalization of violence in politics. And now we have like stories, Mitt Romney saying that like all the reps and the senators get death threats all the time. And Jack Smith has to be protected by the marshals because he's getting death threats. All of Trump's judges get death threats. The Georgia judge delayed ruling for a week to get security in order because of death threats. This is just that we live in a politics distorted by violence, in part because of this approach that they took. In response to the most public display of political violence in my life.
Yeah. The last thing I think I would say about this is that, it reveals something that Jesse Eisenberg talks about in his book, which is a decay in ability among prosecutors and certain parts of the FBI in doing the hard cases. Because what you were describing, like felony murder charges against a bunch of like impoverished black teenagers, that's easy. Right. Those people don't have any money. They can't afford like white shoe law firms. They don't have certainly, tens of thousands of people who will call in death threats to like federal law enforcement and judicial officers.
Right.
And this, charging Trump, as they later turned out, it's a huge pain in the ass because Trump is like the biggest legal troll of all time. He gums up the system with all, every possible ruling. And then, of course, he had that double because he could make all these executive privilege claims. And you knew that these guys were looking at this and going like, oh man, this is going to be a real pain in the ass. How about we get some of these small fish first and we'll maybe kind of think about that later. And then, only when the pressure started coming up, where they're like, okay, well, we can move forward a little bit. I
think
that's right.
Before we move on, do you think, Michael, that there's anything that will come up of any of this that'll affect Trump before the election or during or after, maybe? I don't know.
It does feel like it's hard to say. It's hard to imagine that this guy just constantly being in criminal trials through the summer.
It's a good look, yeah.
Couldn't impact his electoral chances, right? And it does seem like the Manhattan trial is going to start probably in April. The Georgia trial, they're trying to start in July. And assuming the Supreme Court doesn't further delay, which is outside the realm of possibility, but it is possible. The January 6th trial, that could start probably in September. That's pretty much a gauntlet of just trial, right? And not to mention during this time, there will be the handling of the dissolution of his estate, by New York State in his civil fraud case, and they're collecting on their $500 million some odd judgment against him, the seizing of his buildings and stuff. So it does feel like he's maybe his public standing somehow, although slightly rehabilitated since his shameful leaving of office, does feel like it's very crickety, and eventually it's going to fall apart. Whether it will fall apart in time, it's hard to understand, hard to know. Like I don't know, but I have to imagine that it will have some impact on him. Not the same impact as a very clear guilty verdict in the January 6th case would, which he's avoided.
Right. What does anything change in those trials if he becomes president? Does he have any kind of immunity claims if they haven't reached the judgment by that time?
So in the federal cases, he can basically end the investigation. And even if like the jury's reached a verdict, If judgment hasn't been entered, if sentencing hasn't been completed and all that, then it's whatever. The Georgia and the New York cases, no, he doesn't have a pardon power over state law. He might be able to pardon himself for the underlying federal crimes in the New York case and make the case that obviates the felony enhancement to the falsifying business records, because they're only a felony because it's covering up a crime. That would be just a whole issue.
Right.
Yeah. But I think they would have a strong argument that he can't be jailed until after he leaves office, in which case he will never leave office. Like he'll never leave office. He tried to stay in office last time and then he wasn't facing jail. Like he's not going to leave. He will leave when he's dead. Like he'll either die before his term is up. He will remain in power after his term is up and die then, or what we need is a really harsh
we need a harsh cross-examination to give him a heart attack on the stand. That's what we need.
Right. Or the last option is that he will die because that's the only way to get him to leave, essentially, is, like some sort of criminal legal execution in essence. Like that's it. Like that's the man, if he's facing prison, I guess in theory he could take Air Force One to like Moscow or something and then be like, fuck you guys. And choose exile. But I just think he'll try to stay.
And then Snowden assassinates him and comes back to the US a hero.
Right.
It's our weird world.
Yeah.
Two things I'd say about that. First, during the campaign, I think it's also going to be a big factor in that Trump is spending tens of millions of dollars on legal fees.
Yes.
And that is being sourced from, campaign contributions for the most part. And he has recently taken over the RNC for that express purpose. And so every one of these, legal proceedings is going to be $1, or tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of dollars, taken away from not just the Trump campaign, but Republican campaigns generally, to be spent on, dear leader.
Yes.
But I would say also that it's like once, if Trump were to win, I feel like we're basically into a like straight up will to power contest. It's like if he can carry out his regime consolidation plan that the Heritage Foundation has like drawn up for him, to install cronies throughout the bureaucracy and the military, basically doing the Vladimir Putin style bust out operation on American democracy, then, that whether or not that can succeed will sort of determine, I would expect, what will be in the last analysis where it all is, lands. Shall we talk about this immigration thing? Got a little bit of time left.
Sure. Yeah. So we want to talk about the Texas border law.
Yeah. Well, because I have not been paying close attention to it. So can you explain like what that was and how it all went down?
Yeah. So basically, Texas passed its own, essentially its own deportation and immigration laws, empowering it to deport people on its own rather than going through the federal process. That immigration is a federal issue that the federal government handles and that the states do not get essentially any say on, is one of the most fundamental black letter settled pieces of law in, our entire au revoir, I guess. It goes back to at least the 1870s, if not further, back when they were trying to keep, Chinese immigrants out. Literally with an act called the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yeah.
It's just something that, like, not only does the federal government have complete control of our border, but the court has said it's inherent to the sovereignty of the federal government, that it's a power that they often say is outside the bounds of constitutional restriction. Literally, it's called a plenary powers doctrine. That when Congress and the president act together, their powers are plenary. The Supreme Court can't even review it for satisfying constitutional requirements. That is how empowered the federal government has been in regards to the border for as long as anyone on this planet has been alive. And so for Texas to be like, no, we're actually going to do our own immigration is pretty much like, this is a serious upending of the constitutional order, and one that was, rightly put on hold. And then the Supreme Court essentially allowed that to lapse and allowed the law to go into effect. Now, they did so in a way where the liberal justices dissented and said this is a total upending of American law. And a couple conservatives, Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh, wrote a concurrence basically laying out all the ways that the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals had been totally out to lunch and doing everything outside the normal procedures to allow this law to go into effect. And the methods they'd taken seem to be abusing processes, but we have to defer to them anyway and basically let the law go into effect. But this did seem to sufficiently chastise the Fifth Circuit into, in turn, scheduling oral argument, putting the law on hold, and judging from how oral argument went, seems like they will probably strike it down. So we flirted with completely upending the constitutional order. But then,
and presumably because the politics of it were like, the Governor Abbott and the Republicans are like, oh, Biden and the Democrats are letting all these immigrants flood the, yes, and we have to take back our country kind of nonsense, right?
Yeah, it's a manufactured crisis. This is I think one of the judges, a Trump appointee in the Fifth Circuit, who's on the panel, who is very much wants to uphold this law, is like saying like, we're in a crisis. We're in a constitutional crisis. This is like the big issue. It's something
Texas will secede if it has to, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like Abbott had like sort of given the big middle finger to the Supreme Court a few weeks earlier related to stuff like this, like the removal of razor wire on the border. Conservatives are more than happy to say fuck you to the court whenever it doesn't rule their way. And I think you can read Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh's concurrence as a sort of like, we're trying to be nice, but we really need you guys to do this all the proper way, like coddling a spoiled teenager or something.
Yeah, that I think is an instructive example, because I think that one of the biggest enablers of Supreme Court's usurpation of powers, and just like completely lawless behavior, which we'll talk about in a minute here, actually, is the pitiful helplessness of the Democrats and Congress, especially. That's not entirely all about Democrats, but just like the structural dysfunction of Congress being totally unable to respond whenever, the Supreme Court steps on its toes. And, the Biden administration, like they convened that big, panel of, gray bearded, experts, the Council of Elrond or whatever, to talk about reforming the court. And they basically, like, probably not. And then the court's like, they just take that as a green light, whereas if Republicans are like, oh, a bunch of snarling Wolverines, being like, what does law mean to you? Yeah, Amy Coney Barrett, you motherfucker. And then they're like, they're a little more scared.
Yeah. You're going to let us put up razor wire at the border, or you're going to get death threats. That's right.
That's how it works. But
the right is more than happy to discipline the Supreme Court. They don't use legislation to do it, right? They don't use court reform to do it. They just ignore them, or they pass state level laws, sticking their thumb in the eye of Supreme Court rulings. Oh, you say Roe v. Wade's illegal? Guess what? It's not. You know, like that, like for 50 years, that's what they did. It was like, yeah, well, guess what? Not here in Alabama. It's not. Oh, well, okay, but only for the first 6 weeks. Only for the first, right? Like they will just say, fuck you. Where are the states that do that? Where are the states that say, I don't give a shit about what you say about the Second Amendment? We're seizing guns, right? And daring them to stop you. We are regulating campaign finance and daring them to stop you.
Meanwhile, their lobbyists, like the Federal Society and other organizations, are bribing justices and judges to do what they want.
Right.
They understand the carrot and the stick. They got both tools. The Democrats have the hands behind the back.
That I will say, Steve. What's his name? John Oliver did. I think this is maybe his best episode he's done of his show. He actually did that. He drew up a legal contract, a literal legal bribe offer that he would pay Clarence Thomas $1 million a year, plus give him a $2.5 million motor coach if he resigned from the Supreme Court. And it's like it's legal. You could do that.
Yes, so good, so good.
Shall we talk about Chevron deference in our last few minutes here? There's a case coming up before the Supreme Court dealing with something called Chevron deference, which, correct me if I'm wrong here, Michael, but this basically is the idea that when the statutory language is unclear, the courts are supposed to defer to the interpretations of the agencies that are tasked with, carrying out the regulation. So if Congress says to the EPA, regulate dangerous pollutants, the EPA gets to figure out what that means, not the courts. And so this is attempting to overturn that doctrine. Am I right there?
Yeah, you're right. This is something where it's like, I think it's good to have sort of a sense of the structure of the government broadly, which is, like the EPA is a great example. The EPA is something created by Congress to delegate some of its authority to the executive branch. And they say, look, there's so much to do to keep the air clean and the water clean and our trees growing. And we don't have the expertise and we don't have the time to constantly be passing new laws with emission standards and with clean water standards and all that. So instead, we'll just create this agency that the executive can staff, and they can promulgate regulations that have the force of law, but will move much quicker and have a lot of expertise. And this way, like, the government can respond to complicated problems in a timely manner. Chevron deference is essentially a statement about where the Supreme Court and the courts in general sit in that relationship between Congress and the executive, and saying, generally, we're pretty hands off. And generally speaking, this is between you two and your powers. And, Congress says you guys have the expertise and you do. And so as long as what you're doing is reasonable, can be reasonably said to conform with the statutory authority granted you, we're going to let you do it.
And the problem, just to ask you, Michael, the problem is if I have this right, if Congress is too vague in what they're asking the agencies who fall under the executive branch, if they're too vague, then suddenly the kind of rulemaking that the agencies are doing could be construed as the legislative function, which would be wrong for the executive branch to be doing something like that.
Yeah, there's like, they're trying to attack this from a lot of different angles. So yeah, there's like a non-delegation doctrine as well that conservatives really believe in, that yes, if Congress gives them too much authority, well, then yes, they have unconstitutionally delegated their powers. But then if they give them very specific authority, well, then we're going to interpret that very, very, carefully to make sure that the agency is doing everything, crossing every I, dotting every T, right by the book. The whole point is to make it very hard for the agencies to function.
Right, to do its job, yeah.
To do its job, to constantly be kicking things back to Congress, because, as Ryan said earlier, Congress is dysfunctional and it doesn't work. This is a recipe for the courts deciding when the government can regulate and when can it not. And I think we can all guess when the Supreme Court will allow the government to regulate and when it will not. Like emissions standards and clean water and corporate securities fraud and all that shit. Goodbye. Say goodbye to all.
Suddenly they're like post-structuralists, like Derrida, like, I don't know what these words mean, Like,
right. The thing about the Chevron deference rule is that it's always been kind of bullshit in a sense that like ambiguity as a standard is itself ambiguous. You can say something is ambiguous because it's amenable to more than one reasonable reading, in which case just about anything can be ambiguous, and in which case just about anything you defer to the agency's expertise. Or ambiguity can be tuned to be very like, well, as long as there's one reading that's better than the others, this isn't really ambiguous. You need two equally plausible readings in equipoise for it to be ambiguous. Like courts know how to do this, to turn up and down ambiguity when they want, to defer to agencies when they want and not defer to agencies when they want. So the actual formality of overruling Chevron is less important for, empowering courts than it is for sort of stating very plainly, we're in charge. We are the boss. We get to decide what you can and can't do. It is a very bold statement. It's Captain Phillips. Look at me. I'm the captain now.
That's right.
That's what it is.
It's Trump. It's very Trumpian. And if you don't mind, it occurs to me that this is where I think, the famous kind of Corey Robbins, Samuel Moyn, other people who are arguing that Trump isn't especially dangerous, the actual constitutional norms and rules and like the legal system itself has been used to perpetuate as much harm and violence and all these things, which is like true enough. But the thing that I think people might miss, and I'm wondering what you think about this, is like there's a difference, as you say, between using language and actually providing rational arguments to do the power play. And then the brash, like, I don't even need to cover the power play. I'm just going to, and that's like what Trump does. Is like, I don't even need to pretend to be like, like the former presidents are war criminals too, probably, but like they pretended not to be and tried to not get caught. And he's just like, no, we don't need those restraints anymore. And like, I've been trying to argue with Ryan, I think too, that this is like a significant shift. This is worse. This is bad.
I think I agree with that. Yeah, I do. I think, like it's good to be clear-eyed that like it's always underneath everything, it's just a power struggle, right? But there is something that feels like it leads towards authoritarianism about just shedding all the adornments, right? The facade that we put over the power struggle. I don't know. I don't know how quite to articulate it, but I think that's right. It does feel like it moves us one step closer to that. It does feel at the very least like an escalation.
Hypocrisy is a safeguard in a sense, like the person who feels the need to try to pretend like he's not doing the bad thing is not as bad as the one who just does the bad thing enthusiastically without shame.
But why? So the question is, why is that worse? And I'm trying to think of reasons related to the court starting to do the Trumpian stuff. With Trump, it's more obvious. It's like that MAGA dude with his like AK-47 sitting on the porch and like doing an Instagram photo. Like, when's the Civil War start? Like that shit didn't happen before, because they weren't so emboldened to be like, it's cool to be openly violent and like whatever. I don't know what the equivalent is for the court suddenly being like, we don't have to issue justifications. We're just going to do whatever we want.
Yeah, I think it's, I think what it reveals is that a lot of the quote unquote institutional guardrails that have like kept things seemingly semi-democratic, we can argue about the degree to which America is a functioning democracy or whatever, but at least somewhat democratic, were often just self-imposed norms. People deciding, well, this is the way we've done things and this is how we do them. And that keeps everything running. And once you start shedding those, it turns out, well, actually, we don't have to run as a democracy at all. Like we can just do what we want and dare someone to stop us. It's sort of like it feels like it's a one-way ratchet, right? Like we only move one direction from here. Like the norms come back as rules, or they don't come back at all forever. And those guardrails that keeping us semi-democratic just disappear. And that's it.
The norms come back, you could make an example out of someone,
right. That's how the norms come back. That's the thing that's how the norms come back, is there have to be consequences for breaking the norms. This is like, these guys must have been the worst fucking parents. Like,
it's literally the justification for law. Like, law is supposed to be deterrent, because when you punish someone, then that's supposed to deter the future action.
That is the whole
logic.
One of the foundational principles for having a penal system, right? Is that punishment is a deterrent from future lawbreaking.
Yeah. And the one last thing I would emphasize on the Chevron case is that, you have these people, these conservatives, pretending like they're defending the power of Congress. It's like, oh, Congress isn't allowed to delegate this because it's an unconstitutional grant of authority to the executive. But like, what that is in practice is arrogating a huge chunk of Congress's power to the courts, to take that away from them, to prevent them from governing. Because, what is delegation but an exercise of congressional authority to say, right, executive, here is a bunch of instructions. You take this, you go look at the air, you look at the water, you clean that shit up. I don't want to figure out how to do it. You figure out how to do it. I'm telling you, I'm ordering you to do this. And I was saying, I'm protecting Congress by saying that they're not allowed to exercise power in this way. Bullshit. It's like, every district court is going to be swamped with lawsuits from interested parties trying to overturn any regulation that has any effect on anybody rich, if this goes the way it is. And it's just turning this place into a sort of quasi legal dictatorship, a guardian council or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's right. It is. And to that point also, like, Congress, when they're unhappy, when the executive can amend the statute, they can either like further empower or mandate action, or rescind power and say, no, you can't do that. Like, Congress can do that. Congress can take care of itself. They don't need their big brother, the court, to like step in and, mediate this dispute with the executive. Like, and it's obviously bullshit, because it's not, that's not what's really going on here, right? The interests that are being protected aren't Congress's. They're partisan Republican interests, who want a smaller federal government and a smaller tax, and as a result, a smaller amount of taxes. That's it. They don't want to. And they don't want to pay for this shit.
Yet another like hypocrisy argument can be leveled against the court, because the Scalias of the world are famous for not wanting to, like, judges aren't philosophers or technocrats, or like, Kagan, I think, asked, like, do you really want to be figuring out like some of this shit? Like, this is our role. This was the conservative line. We don't know anything about the world. We just know the law, right?
Yeah, no, Scalia is actually like, he came up in like the Reagan era. And so he was very deferential to agencies. And this is a marked shift. This is an area where the court has moved very far right in a very short period of time. This is essentially the New Deal legal framework, right? If you've ever heard of the switch in time saves 9 and the whole thing, FDR threatening to pack the courts to uphold his New Deal legislation. The administrative state as it exists now is essentially the result of this big compromise we had in the 40s about how power is shared between the state and the federal government and the states, and how power is shared between the courts, the executive, and Congress. And the Supreme Court's like, fuck that. Like, we are taking a hatchet to that, and the entire structure of our society, resides on this foundation. So it's
not looking good, Michael.
It's revolutionary or counter-revolutionary, really, I think.
Something else to mention in that John Oliver piece is that Clarence Thomas used to be a deference guy. that because he came up in basically the same milieu as Scalia, maybe a little bit later. But he was threatened to quit there for a while unless he made a lot more money, and started going on swanky vacations with all these right-wing billionaires who hate agency deference. And lo and behold, changed his position, so like that a lot of people make that point that, a lot of these judges aren't corrupt in the way that, like, you're handing over sacks of cash to someone to, like, say what their ruling is, but more that, there's a sort of incentive structure created such that certain types of people are promoted up through the ranks and are lavished, because they sort of like develop these opinions like dialectically almost. But in that case, right, you literally have giant sacks of cash, swanky vacations with billionaires, and then you change your opinion on something,
Right. It's just like one or two extra steps.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like we're not really wandering that far afield of, the big burlap sack with the dollar signs on it in exchange for, like, the written, I pledge to vote this way on this case, right? Yeah. Like we're only like 2 degrees from that.
Yeah.
So
that's always how corruption works, in any actual non-cartoon, Menendez context, with the gold bars.
With the gold bars, like, under your bed.
Cool. Well, yeah, that's probably all the time we have. But Michael, thanks for coming on. Everyone,
thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Go listen to 5-4 podcast, one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's fantastic. We'll link to it in the notes for sure.
And thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode.